December 1941. The Hawaiian sun had barely risen when Lieutenant James Mitchell watched the Pacific horizon from Wheeler Field, his coffee growing cold in his hands. The previous weeks had transformed him from a confident pilot into something else, a survivor, carrying the weight of friends lost to an enemy aircraft that seemed invincible. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero had earned its reputation through blood and wreckage, leaving American pilots scrambling for answers in the smoking ruins of their confidence. Mitchell's hand still trembled slightly when he gripped a control stick, not from fear, but from the memory of that morning when the sky filled with rising suns painted on enemy wings. He had watched his squadron mates fall, their P-40 Warhawks tumbling from the sky like broken toys against opponents who danced through the air with impossible grace. The Zero pilots had turned and climbed with such agility that traditional dogfighting tactics became suicide missions. Every American pilot knew the statistics. The Zero could outmaneuver, outclimb, and seemed untouchable in the hands of Japan's experienced naval aviators. If you want to discover how one pilot's determination changed the course of aerial warfare in the Pacific, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. This story reveals the human courage behind tactical innovation that saved countless lives. The debriefing room at Wheeler Field smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Mitchell sat among the surviving pilots, 23 men who had started the month as 37. Colonel Patterson stood before them, his face carved with lines that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he laid out the grim reality. The Zero outperformed every American fighter in a turning fight. It climbed faster, turned tighter, and its pilots had years of combat experience from China. The only advantage the P-40 possessed was diving speed and rugged construction, but those seemed like poor consolation prizes when your enemy could loop inside your turn radius and put cannon shells through your cockpit. Patterson's briefing included intelligence reports from British pilots who had faced Zeros over Singapore and Malaya. The pattern was consistent. Experienced Allied pilots attempting traditional combat maneuvers found themselves quickly overwhelmed. The Zero could perform a complete loop in the time it took most Allied fighters to complete half of one. Its climb rate meant that pilots who tried to escape vertically simply presented their vulnerable undersides to enemy guns. Squadron after squadron had learned these lessons through catastrophic losses, and now it was Wheeler Field's turn to absorb the same bitter knowledge. Mitchell watched the faces of his fellow pilots as Patterson spoke. Some showed defiance, determined to prove they were skilled enough to beat the Zero at its own game. Others wore the hollow expression of men who had already accepted that survival was mostly luck. A few, like Captain Chen, showed something different, a calculating intensity, treating the briefing as a puzzle to be solved rather than a death sentence to be accepted. Those were the faces Mitchell focused on, the pilots who might be willing to think differently about how combat should be conducted. After the briefing, Mitchell remained seated while others filed out. Patterson noticed and approached, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. The colonel sat down beside Mitchell, close enough that their conversation wouldn't carry to any lingering pilots. Patterson asked what Mitchell was thinking, and there was genuine curiosity in the question rather than the dismissive tolerance many senior officers showed to junior pilots' opinions. Mitchell hesitated, then shared the memory of that Zero breaking off pursuit during his dive. Patterson listened without interrupting, his eyes distant, perhaps remembering similar moments from his own combat experience. The colonel admitted something Mitchell hadn't expected. Patterson had flown SE-5A fighters over France in 1918, and he remembered when German pilots first started using the high-speed diving attacks that became known as Dicta-Bilka tactics. British pilots at the time had considered such attacks unsporting, preferring the traditional turning dogfights that showcased individual skill. But the Germans who used diving tactics survived longer and achieved better results. Patterson had been young enough then to adapt, learning that survival and victory mattered more than maintaining traditional notions of how aerial combat should be conducted. He told Mitchell to pursue his theory, but warned him that convincing an entire military establishment to change its tactical doctrine would be harder than any combat mission. Mitchell listened, but his mind kept returning to one specific moment during that chaotic morning. A Zero had been on his tail, and in desperation, he had pushed his Warhawk into a steep dive, the airframe shuddering as he exceeded recommended speeds. The Zero had followed initially, but then broke off the pursuit. At the time, Mitchell had been too focused on survival to analyze why, but now that memory gnawed at him. Something about that dive had made the Zero pilot abandon what should have been an easy kill. That evening, Mitchell sat in the officers' quarters with Captain Robert Chen, one of the few pilots who had managed multiple engagements with Zeros and survived. Chen was a quiet man, methodical, the son of Chinese immigrants who spoke little but observed everything. He had been flying patrols over the Philippines before the war and had seen the Zero in action against Chinese aircraft. They spread Mitchell's notes across a worn table, sketching diagrams of combat encounters, trying to piece together a puzzle from fragments of terror and adrenaline. The breakthrough came not from tactical manuals, but from wreckage. A Zero had crashed relatively intact on the outskirts of Oahu, and Mitchell had convinced a skeptical maintenance officer to let him examine it. The aircraft was beautiful in its simplicity, constructed with an almost artistic attention to weight reduction. Mitchell ran his hands along the thin aluminum skin, noting how it flexed under pressure. The frame was lightweight, sacrificing protection for performance. No armor plating protected the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks guarded against fire. The Japanese had built an aircraft that was essentially a high-performance coffin, betting that superiority in combat would compensate for vulnerability. The maintenance officer, Chief Warrant Officer Samuel Hayes, had been servicing aircraft since the previous war. He walked Mitchell through the Zero's construction with professional admiration mixed with horror. Hayes pointed out how the fuel tanks were integrated directly into the wing structure with no protective lining. A single incendiary round could turn the entire aircraft into a fireball. The cockpit canopy was fixed, meaning a wounded pilot had limited ability to escape. The control surfaces were fabric-covered, vulnerable to even small-caliber rounds. Every design choice prioritized performance over protection, creating an aircraft that excelled in combat but offered no forgiveness for mistakes or misfortune. Hayes shared something else that struck Mitchell as significant. The Zero's engine, a Nakajima Sakai radial, was optimized for high power at low altitude and medium speeds. It performed exceptionally during the climbing turns and slow-speed maneuvers that characterized traditional dogfighting. But Hayes suspected, based on the engineering compromises he observed, that the engine would struggle to maintain power during sustained high-speed operations. The cooling system seemed undersized for prolonged full-throttle running, and the supercharger setup suggested the aircraft would lose performance advantage at higher altitudes. These weren't weaknesses in the traditional sense. They were natural consequences of the design philosophy that made the Zero excel at its intended role. Mitchell spent hours examining the wreckage, measuring dimensions, studying the control system, understanding how the Zero achieved its remarkable agility. The ailerons were large and sensitive, giving exceptional roll rate at low speeds but likely becoming heavy and unresponsive at high speeds. The wing loading was incredibly low, providing superb turning performance, but also limiting diving speed due to structural concerns. Every advantage came with a corresponding limitation, invisible during the kinds of combat the Zero was designed to dominate, but potentially exploitable if American pilots could change the nature of the engagement. Chen joined him at the crash site as the tropical afternoon rain began to fall. They stood under the Zero's wing, water streaming off the rising sun insignia, and discussed what they were seeing. The aircraft's design philosophy was the opposite of American engineering. Where the P-40 was built like a tank, accepting performance compromises for pilot survivability, the Zero was built like a racing yacht, accepting fatal vulnerability for combat agility. This wasn't just an engineering choice, it revealed a fundamental difference in how each nation valued its pilots' lives. Mitchell's theory began to crystallize. If the Zero was built for turning combat, then the solution was to refuse to turn with it. The P-40 couldn't outmaneuver the Zero, but it could outdive it. The American fighter was heavier, more rugged, with a more powerful engine and straight-line speed. What if American pilots stopped trying to dogfight and instead used hit-and-run tactics? Dive from altitude, make a single high-speed pass, and zoom back to altitude before the Zero could respond. Never get slow, never turn tight, never give the Zero the fight it was designed to win. But theories needed testing, and testing meant risking his life against an enemy that had killed too many of his friends. Mitchell presented his ideas to Colonel Patterson, who listened with the exhausted patience of a man who had heard too many desperate plans. Patterson was old enough to remember dogfights over France in the previous war, where honor and aerobatic skill determined victory. Mitchell's tactics felt wrong to that generation, like running from a fight rather than winning it, but Patterson was also smart enough to know that dead heroes didn't win wars. The colonel authorized Mitchell to conduct training exercises based on these new tactics. For 2 weeks, Mitchell drilled his squadron relentlessly. They practiced diving attacks, energy management, maintaining speed discipline. It felt unnatural, every instinct screaming to pull into a tight turn and engage the enemy properly. But Mitchell hammered the lessons home. Speed is life, altitude is life insurance, and pride is what gets you killed. The younger pilots adapted quickly, their egos not yet hardened by years of traditional fighter doctrine. The older pilots struggled, their muscle memory fighting against tactics that felt like cowardice. The training regimen Mitchell developed was systematic and unforgiving. Each morning began with altitude climbs, pushing the P-40s to their service ceiling and learning to operate effectively in the thin air where most pilots felt uncomfortable. Mitchell insisted his pilots become intimate with their aircraft's performance at every altitude, understanding exactly how much speed they could convert to altitude and how much altitude they could trade for speed. They practiced boom and zoom attacks against each other, with one flight playing the role of Zeros at lower altitude while another flight dove from above. The pilots playing Zeros were instructed to attempt turning with the attackers, mimicking the Zeros' superior maneuverability, forcing the attacking pilots to maintain discipline and not get drawn into turning combat. Lieutenant Bradford initially struggled with the new tactics. He was an exceptional pilot in the traditional sense, with superb feel for his aircraft, and instinctive ability to place his fighter exactly where he wanted it in three-dimensional space. But those same instincts worked against him when Mitchell's tactics required counterintuitive responses. During one training sortie, Bradford had a perfect diving attack lined up but pulled too hard on the stick coming out of the dive, bleeding off speed in a climbing turn that would have left him vulnerable to a real Zero. Mitchell's radio correction was harsh and immediate. Bradford's natural talent was trying to get him killed. The young pilot needed to learn that perfect technique in a turning fight meant nothing if that turning fight was where the enemy wanted him to be. The training also revealed which pilots had the temperament for energy fighting. Lieutenant Harold Fisher, a farm boy from Nebraska, lacked Bradford's natural flying ability but possessed something more valuable: patience. Fisher could maintain discipline through multiple attack passes, waiting for exactly the right opportunity rather than forcing shots that required getting slow and vulnerable. During practice engagements, Fisher often scored fewer simulated kills than more aggressive pilots, but his aircraft was never in a position where a real Zero could have shot him down. Mitchell recognized that Fisher's approach, while less glamorous, was exactly what would keep pilots alive against superior maneuvering opponents. Chen worked with Mitchell on refining the tactical concepts, adding layers of sophistication to the basic boom and zoom approach. They developed hand signals and radio calls for coordinated attacks, allowing flights to maintain altitude separation while setting up successive diving passes that gave Zeros no time to recover between attacks. Chen emphasized the importance of mutual support. No P-40 should ever be alone at slow speed, and every diving attack should have another P-40 positioned to cover the attacker's exit. These concepts weren't revolutionary, but applying them consistently required practice and discipline that traditional fighter training hadn't emphasized. The squadron also practiced disengagement, learning to recognize when breaking off combat was necessary. Mitchell established clear rules. If you dropped below 250 miles per hour indicated airspeed, you were in danger and needed to disengage immediately. If you found yourself in a sustained turn with an enemy, you had made a mistake and needed to dive away. If your flight became separated, you regrouped at altitude rather than trying to win individual dogfights. These rules went against every fighter pilot instinct, but Mitchell backed them up with cold mathematics. Pilots who followed the rules survived. Pilots who trusted their individual skill against Zeros mostly didn't. The first real test came on a clear morning in January 1942. Intelligence reported a Japanese reconnaissance flight heading toward the islands. Mitchell led a four-ship formation to intercept, his heart pounding not with fear, but with the terrible anticipation of proving whether his theory would save lives or waste them. They climbed to 20,000 feet, the P-40s straining in the thin air, and waited. Mitchell's flight consisted of pilots he had trained personally, Bradford on his wing, Chen leading the second element with Fisher as his wingman. Each pilot knew the plan, had practiced it dozens of times, but this would be the first time they bet their lives on tactics that contradicted everything they had been taught about fighter combat. The climb to altitude took 17 minutes, and during that time, Mitchell reviewed the tactical plan repeatedly in his mind. They would position themselves with sun behind them, approaching from the enemy's 6 o'clock high position. The initial attack would be Mitchell's element diving first, with Chen's element remaining high to cover and set up a follow-up attack. Speed discipline was critical. They needed to hit at least 350 miles per hour in the dive to ensure they could zoom away before Zeros could react. Radio discipline was equally important. Short, factual calls only, no chatter that might distract or confuse. The Zeros appeared as specks against the blue, 3 fighters escorting a reconnaissance plane. Mitchell's radio crackled with discipline as he positioned his flight. They would approach from above and behind, use the sun, make one pass, and break away. No turning combat, no matter what happened. His wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Bradford, had been in his class at flight school. They had talked about flying since they were children, dreaming of aerial combat as something noble and clean. Now Bradford's voice over the radio was tight with tension as they rolled into their attack dive. Mitchell rolled inverted and pulled through into a steep dive, Bradford following his every move. The altimeter unwound rapidly as they accelerated. The P-40's rugged airframe protesting but holding together as airspeed climbed past 300, then 350, then 400 miles per hour. The Zeros grew from specks to recognizable aircraft. Their distinctive profiles burned into Mitchell's memory from hours studying intelligence photos. The lead Zero was slightly ahead and below the other two, in a loose Vic formation that suggested they weren't expecting trouble. Good. Surprise was multiplying the impact of the dive attack. The world narrowed to the illuminated gun sight, the target growing larger, airspeed indicator climbing past safe limits. Mitchell fired, saw his tracers converge, felt the P-40 shudder from the 650 caliber machine guns firing in concert. Pieces flew from the Zero's wing root, but Mitchell didn't wait to see more. He hauled back on the stick and zoomed away, the G-forces crushing him into his seat as the P-40 converted that dangerous diving speed back into altitude. Bradford's radio call was clipped and professional. He was clear and climbing, no apparent damage to his aircraft. Behind them, the Zeros scattered, trying to follow, but the Americans were already climbing away at speeds the lightly built Japanese fighters couldn't match without risking structural failure. Chen's voice came over the radio, calm and measured, calling his diving attack. Mitchell continued his zoom climb, bleeding speed but regaining altitude, positioning for another attack while monitoring Chen's element through their attack run. The tactical dance was working, each element attacking, while the other maintained altitude advantage, never giving the Zeros the slow speed turning fight they needed to use their superior agility. They repeated the pattern 3 more times, each diving attack further frustrating the Zero pilots, who could see their opponents but couldn't force the Americans into the kind of combat where Japanese training and aircraft superiority would dominate. Chen's second attack damaged another Zero, and Fisher's guns managed to hit the reconnaissance plane, forcing it to break off and head back toward Japanese-held territory. The Zero pilots grew increasingly aggressive, trying desperately to lure the Americans into turning combat, executing impossible-looking vertical maneuvers that would have been deadly if Mitchell's pilots had taken the bait. But Mitchell kept his pilots disciplined, repeating the mantra that had become their survival creed: maintain speed, maintain altitude advantage, attack only when conditions are perfect. On the 4th pass, one of the Zeros made a mistake, bleeding too much energy trying to follow Bradford's zoom climb. The Japanese pilot had probably been frustrated by multiple attack runs he couldn't counter, leading him to hold his turn too long, trying to get guns on target. Mitchell came screaming down from above, perfectly positioned, and this time his bullets found their mark comprehensively. The Zero came apart, its fragile structure unable to withstand both combat damage and high-speed stress. Mitchell didn't celebrate, simply called the kill over the radio and continued through his attack run, diving away and setting up for another potential pass. The remaining Zeros, recognizing they couldn't catch the Americans and having lost one fighter with another damaged, broke off and headed back toward their base. Mitchell's formation maintained altitude and watched them go, every pilot fighting the instinct to pursue. Pursuit would mean diving after retreating enemies, potentially into traps, certainly into the kind of running fight where the Zero's qualities would become relevant. The tactical plan required discipline through the entire engagement, including knowing when victory meant simply surviving with your mission accomplished and your pilots intact. The formation returned to Wheeler Field with all 4 aircraft intact. It was the first time an American unit had engaged Zeros without losses. The debriefing room filled with pilots from other squadrons, and Mitchell walked them through every detail. The tactics worked, but they required discipline that went against every traditional fighter pilot instinct. You had to accept that you wouldn't always get a kill. You had to swallow your pride and dive away when every fiber wanted to stay and fight. You had to trust that energy and speed would eventually give you opportunities, even if it meant breaking contact 20 times to get one good shot. Word spread through the Pacific theater slowly, carried by pilots who rotated between squadrons, by intelligence officers who recognized the value of Mitchell's approach. Captain Claire Chenot, commanding the American Volunteer Group in China, heard about the tactics and incorporated them into his own training. His pilots were flying P-40s against overwhelming numbers of Japanese aircraft, and Mitchell's methods gave them a framework for survival. The Flying Tigers would later credit these energy-fighting tactics as crucial to their success, allowing a small force to hold its own against superior numbers. Chenot, a fighter tactician with years of experience, immediately recognized the value of Mitchell's approach because it aligned with conclusions he had been developing independently. The AVG had been using similar hit-and-run tactics out of necessity, but Mitchell's systematic approach gave structure to what had been improvised responses. Chenot added his own refinements based on the unique conditions in China. His pilots often operated from poorly equipped airfields with limited maintenance support, facing Japanese formations that sometimes included dozens of aircraft. The AVG developed techniques for coordinated attacks by multiple flights, using radio communication to set up successive diving passes that kept Japanese formations constantly defensive. The information flow wasn't just one direction. Pilots returning from China brought combat reports that validated and refined Mitchell's concepts. They confirmed that Zeros operating at higher altitudes lost much of their performance advantage, struggling with engines optimized for lower altitude operations. They reported that Zero pilots, despite exceptional skill and experience, had difficulty adapting to opponents who refused traditional dogfighting. The Japanese training emphasized the offensive, closing with the enemy, using superior maneuverability to gain advantage and destroying opponents in close quarters combat. When American pilots refused to close, maintaining distance and using speed to control engagement parameters, it negated much of that training advantage. But implementing new tactics across an entire theater was like turning an aircraft carrier, slow, requiring constant pressure, meeting resistance at every level. Many senior officers remained skeptical. Fighter combat was about courage and skill in close quarters maneuvering, not hit-and-run attacks that seemed to abandon comrades in need. Mitchell found himself defending his methods in officers' clubs and briefing rooms, arguing with men whose experience in the previous war had taught them different lessons. Some saw energy fighting as cowardice disguised as tactics, a way to avoid the risks that combat necessarily entailed. Others worried that teaching pilots to disengage would undermine the aggressive spirit necessary for victory. The Army Air Forces had a proud tradition of aggressive fighter doctrine, influenced heavily by instructors who had flown in the previous war. The romanticism of that earlier conflict, individual duels between skilled pilots, chivalrous combat where personal courage and flying ability determined outcomes, still shaped how many officers thought about aerial warfare. Mitchell's tactics seemed to strip away that romance, reducing combat to mathematics and energy management rather than skill and courage. For older officers who had built their careers and reputations around traditional fighter doctrine, accepting Mitchell's methods meant acknowledging that much of their experience might be obsolete. The resistance came to a head in March when Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, a decorated veteran from the First World War, confronted Mitchell publicly. Harrison had been a balloon buster, had downed 3 German fighters in turning combat, and considered Mitchell's tactics cowardly. The confrontation happened in front of an entire squadron, Harrison's voice carrying across the ready room as he accused Mitchell of teaching young pilots to run from fights. The room fell silent, every eye on Mitchell, waiting to see how he would respond. Harrison's argument was articulate and passionate. He spoke about the warrior spirit, about the importance of closing with the enemy, about how hit-and-run tactics would undermine the aggressive mindset necessary for air superiority. Mitchell stood slowly, keeping his voice level. He didn't argue about honor or courage. Instead, he walked to the status board and pointed to the names of pilots killed in action since December. 29 names, 29 men who had fought bravely using traditional tactics against an enemy aircraft designed to win exactly that kind of fight. He let that number sink in, then pointed to his own squadron's status. 13 missions against zeros, 2 losses, 7 confirmed kills. The 2 losses had been pilots who broke discipline, who let their aggressive instincts override tactical discipline, who thought they could beat a zero in the kind of fight the zero was designed to win. Mitchell didn't stop there. He asked Harrison a simple question. What was the mission of a fighter squadron? Harrison started to answer about destroying enemy aircraft, but Mitchell interrupted. The mission was to control airspace, to protect friendly forces, to deny the enemy the ability to operate freely. Sometimes that required destroying enemy aircraft, but sometimes it simply required making enemy operations too costly or ineffective. If American fighters could force Japanese formations to break off attacks, to jettison bombs without hitting targets, to expend fuel maneuvering defensively instead of accomplishing their missions, then American fighters were succeeding even without scoring kills. Survival and mission accomplishment mattered more than individual glory. Harrison stared at the board for a long moment, and something in his face shifted. He was old enough to remember the casualty lists from 1917, the thousands of young pilots who had died learning hard lessons over the trenches. The romance of individual aerial combat had been built on those casualties, countless young men killed while the doctrine slowly evolved. Harrison had survived that carnage partly through skill, but mostly through luck, and he recognized the same dynamic playing out in the Pacific. The difference was that Mitchell was offering a way to skip some of those hard lessons, to adopt tactics that might save lives rather than insisting on learning everything through blood. The colonel nodded once, curtly, and left the ready room without another word. Mitchell never knew whether he had changed Harrison's mind or simply made the colonel recognize that this was a different war, requiring different solutions. But the confrontation had an impact beyond the immediate moment. Other officers who had been quietly skeptical saw Harrison's reaction and reconsidered their own positions. If a decorated veteran from the previous war could acknowledge the value of new tactics, perhaps those tactics deserved serious consideration rather than reflexive resistance. The tactics spread not through official doctrine, but through the informal networks of combat pilots. A pilot from Mitchell's squadron would rotate to another base, train with new units, and carry the knowledge forward. Letters home included sketches and notes that fellow pilots would read and discuss. By summer 1942, American fighter squadrons across the Pacific were incorporating energy fighting tactics, adapting them to local conditions and aircraft types. The Wildcat, the P-39, even the early P-38s, pilots learned to use their aircraft's strengths rather than trying to match the zero in its element. Mitchell continued flying combat missions through 1942, refining his understanding of energy tactics with each engagement. He learned that altitude advantage could be converted to speed, and speed could be converted back to altitude, creating a cycle of opportunity that the lighter Zero struggled to match. He learned to read enemy formations, identifying which pilots were veterans who wouldn't fall for simple tricks, and which were newer recruits who might make mistakes. Every mission added to his understanding, and every debriefing shared that knowledge with other pilots. In August, Mitchell's squadron intercepted a large Japanese formation attacking Allied shipping, 15 Zeros against 8 P-40s, odds that would have been suicidal 6 months earlier. But Mitchell's pilots had internalized the tactics, moved as a coordinated unit, and used the vertical dimension of the sky like terrain. They dove, attacked, zoomed away, repositioned, and dove again. The battle lasted 30 minutes, and when it ended, the Japanese formation had been scattered and driven off. 2 P-40s returned with damage, but no pilots were lost. The intelligence officer who debriefed them noted something interesting. Japanese radio intercepts from that engagement showed confusion and frustration among the Zero pilots. They described the American tactics as cowardly, but also admitted difficulty countering them. The Zero pilots were experiencing what American pilots had felt in those early weeks, facing an enemy who refused to fight the kind of battle you were trained to win. By late 1942, new American aircraft began reaching the Pacific. The F-4U Corsair, improved models of the P-38, and eventually the P-51 Mustang. These aircraft could match or exceed the Zero's performance in most regimes. But the tactical lessons Mitchell had developed remained relevant. Energy fighting became foundational doctrine for American fighter pilots, emphasizing speed and altitude management over turning performance. The skills his squadron had learned through desperation became standard training for all fighter pilots. Mitchell rotated stateside in early 1943, having flown 117 combat missions. He spent the next 2 years as an instructor, teaching new pilots the tactics that had emerged from those desperate months after Pearl Harbor. He watched young men arrive, full of confidence and Hollywood notions of aerial combat, and he worked to instill the discipline that would keep them alive. Some resisted, wanting the glory of dogfighting. Mitchell would take them aside and show them the letters he carried, letters from the families of pilots in his original squadron, thanking him for bringing their sons home. The human cost of those early months never left him. Mitchell kept a leather notebook with the names of every pilot from his original squadron who had been killed before they learned how to fight the Zero effectively. 23 names, written in careful block letters, men who had died because no one had yet figured out how to counter an enemy aircraft that outperformed theirs in traditional combat. He never spoke about the notebook publicly, but his fellow instructors knew he carried it, knew that it reminded him why the tactics mattered more than pride. The war ended in 1945. And Mitchell returned to civilian life carrying knowledge that had helped shift the balance of aerial warfare in the Pacific. He never claimed to have invented energy fighting. Similar concepts had been developing simultaneously across multiple squadrons and theaters. But his early recognition of the Zero's weaknesses and strengths, and his willingness to abandon traditional tactical doctrine, had contributed to a broader evolution in American fighter tactics. Years later, historians studying the Pacific Air War would identify the transition from traditional dogfighting to energy tactics as a crucial turning point. The Zero remained a formidable opponent throughout the war, but American pilots learned to negate its advantages by refusing to fight on its terms. Mitchell's contribution was one part of a larger shift, but it represented something important: the willingness to learn from defeat, to adapt, rather than simply try harder using methods that weren't working. Mitchell rarely spoke about the war in his later years. He became a commercial pilot, flying the same routes over the Pacific that he had once fought to defend. Sometimes, on clear days at altitude, he would look down at the ocean and remember the desperation of those early months, the feeling of facing an enemy that seemed unbeatable, and the slow realization that victory would come not from matching their strengths, but from exploiting their weaknesses. The leather notebook with 23 names remained in his possession until his death in 1987. In his will, he left it to the Air Force Museum, along with a simple note explaining its significance. The notebook is displayed now alongside his medals and flight records, a reminder that tactical innovation often emerges from the hardest lessons paid for by pilots who didn't survive long enough to see their sacrifices lead to better methods. The story of American pilots learning to fight the Zero is usually told through statistics and tactical diagrams, but behind those numbers were men like Mitchell, who faced an enemy aircraft that outperformed theirs and refused to accept that disadvantage as permanent. They studied their enemy, understood their own aircraft's strengths and limitations, and developed tactics that transformed weakness into advantage. It wasn't magic or sudden inspiration. It was careful observation, rigorous testing, and the courage to abandon traditional doctrine when tradition led to death. The Pacific Air War continued for 3 more years after Mitchell's breakthrough, with countless pilots refining and adapting energy fighting tactics to new aircraft and situations. But those desperate weeks in early 1942 established principles that would guide American fighter doctrine for decades. Speed and energy management, maintaining altitude advantage, coordinated attacks that prevented the enemy from dictating the terms of combat. These concepts became foundational because pilots like Mitchell proved they worked when nothing else did. Mitchell's legacy isn't measured in his personal victory count or the medals he received. It's measured in the pilots who survived because someone had figured out how to fight effectively against a superior performing enemy aircraft. Every American pilot who flew in the Pacific after 1942 benefited from the lessons learned in those early months, from the recognition that tactical innovation could overcome technical disadvantage, and from the discipline to fight smart rather than simply fighting bravely. The sun set over the Pacific the same way in 1945 as it had in 1941, but the pilots who watched it had changed. They had learned that warfare demanded constant adaptation, that pride was less important than effectiveness, and that survival often required abandoning comfortable assumptions about how combat should be conducted. Mitchell carried those lessons with him for the rest of his life, a quiet testament to the price of tactical evolution and the human courage required to admit when traditional methods no longer worked.